All right, we're good. Okay, welcome everyone. Here we are in July already. It's hot out there. Everyone be safe when you're out working on your stations and doing other such things. July already, geez.
Yeah.
So I'm just gonna get into it here, do my spiel here. For those who are attending for the first time, I don't know if we have any newcomers or not, but I guess for the foreseeable future, I'll do this intro stuff. So every third Thursday of the month, 2:30 to 3:30 every month, this is the same Zoom link, so feel free to put this Zoom into your calendars. It'll continue to be the same one. I am sending emails a week prior and then in the morning of. So if you have any people that you would like to, attend these meetings or who might be interested in attending, please feel free to send them the Zoom link and also put me in touch with, or at least send me their email address and I can put them on the distribution list. So just as a reminder, we are doing these meetings and supporting groups across the Delaware Basin with these EnviroDIY stations via primarily the Delaware River Watershed Initiative through the William Penn Foundation. And we are supporting groups that are working directly in the DRWI, but also supporting groups that are just in the DRB, but are not directly associated with the DRWI. And also providing some support to Pennsylvania folks with Seesaw money, Consortium for Scientific Assistance to Watersheds. So here's the site for the DRWI, 4 states, 1 source. Feel free to check that out. And then here's the Seesaw site. If Pennsylvania groups are interested in additional assistance or assistance that isn't directly related to EnviroDIY stations, you can talk to us about that as well for that type of work. So just goals for these meetings is just a time for us to check in and present updates and ask questions. Our presentations are from station managers as well as topic presentations, such as the one today from Mike Burns at Villanova. Here's our folks that are directly involved with just this EnviroDIY network in the DRB. Me, Rachel Johnson, Krista, and Shannon, and then Master Watershed Stewards, Carol Armstrong and George Seeds. But the meeting is being recorded, just keep that in mind. And then these recordings, as well as all of our other support materials, everyone should know this site by now, but feel free to access. There's some new materials in there that I'm going to get to here in a few minutes. So just to reiterate, our primary goal continues to be supporting station owners to use these stations for their own purposes. We're continuing to develop materials to help in doing that. And the secondary goal, we are at the Stroud Center doing some internal data analysis and developing products to help basically anyone to work with these stations and to work with Monitor My Watershed. So here's our agenda today. I'm going to do a few updates here in a couple minutes. Mike is going to talk about some interesting topics in the Philly area that he's been working on, evapotranspiration and such. So getting into updates. Rachel and I are going to be collecting chemistry grab samples to be analyzed for all of these parameters this summer. This is kind of a follow-up to what we've been doing when we install stations. We generally collect a sample and analyze it for these parameters. These have changed a little bit over the 4 years that we've been doing this, but this is our current list. So we're going to be measuring suspended sediments, dissolved organic carbon, chlorides, NH4, NO3, PO4, total nitrogen, total phosphorus, and then all of these cations. Okay, so this will give a good, some sites, this will be the second full suite that we have collected, so it gives a better foundation and a little bit more fuller picture of these sites. we're currently contacting station owners to get permission, and so some of you we've already spoken with. We'll also be sending out a big email to all station owners just to let everyone know that we're going to be accessing these sites. We put together this new service request form. It is available on the Wiki Watershed /DRWI website. This service request form it's kind of a pilot at this point. We're just going to test it out, but it's essentially going to be a way for us to receive information from folks who are kind of needing assistance in troubleshooting their station or anything else. But it's essentially a way for us to have a little bit of more of a formal and formatted way to receive information so that we can keep it a little more organized and ask for a bit of upfront information just to help us with the initial troubleshooting. So feel free to use this as issues come up with your station. If you're not able to deal with them on your own with the guidance materials and such that are available, then feel free to access this form via this web page. It's just a Google form. You just click this link and you'll immediately go into the Google form, and you can fill out that form, and there's a variety of different information to include that will help us in beginning the troubleshooting process. So feel free to use this form, pass it on to others that you're working with if you think they would be better to use it, or just others who might want to use it. And feel free to give us feedback on it as well. Okay, there's also another list on here that is relatively new. It's this support supplies list where there's a number of different links for supplies like SD cards and adapters, as well as this power setup with a charger, the wall adapter, the battery pack, and the cable. So those are the 4 things that you need to basically be able to charge and then swap out batteries at your station. Some stations don't need it, but some stations do. So if your station is losing power at certain times due to just not charging enough, then this is a good setup to get. But there's other supplies listed in there, brushes and stuff like that, so feel free to access that. And then just wanted to mention again this quick guide for recommended roles and responsibilities for managing a station. It's in that same location, and it just lays out 4 basic roles. So the roles of the station owner manager, recommended daily roles of just checking and monitor my watershed, and then the basics of cleaning a station, recommended weekly. As we know, that's very situational. And then the basic steps for doing the quality control. And again, we recommend that on a quarterly basis or just according to situational needs. And then, station manager role in a lot of cases would be simply to make sure that these different roles are being done according to timelines that are laid out organizationally. Okay, just a few technology updates. We're still testing the new cell boards, having some good feedback on those. We have those out at a number of stations and are getting some good information back. They seem to be performing pretty well. And then there is an updated Mayfly data logger coming soon. Shannon, anything you want to mention? Shannon?
Well, no, we can just mention that we've actually, the cell boards we've had for a number of months now, we've had really good results with them. So we've ordered a large production run of those along with the new Mayfly updated board. So all of those electronics products have been ordered. They're being manufactured now, and we should have more information for everybody about this time next month. So probably during next month's monthly meeting, we'll be able to tell everybody all the details of where they can get those parts and or other information on that. So yeah, look for all that info next month at the meeting.
Wonderful.
I have a question, Shannon. Was that problem, was it sort of batch related or design related? Because I bought 5, 6 of them that I've installed for my low-cost sensors, and I've had no problems. But it sounded like you had lots of problems. So was that a design upgrade or a batch problem, quality problem?
On which product are you talking about?
Oh, on the modem, the 4G modem, the purple one.
That was more of a hardware issue with the circuit board made by that other company. So what we've decided to do is just build our own from scratch using a different module. So it's going to be a completely different cell board. It will be more similar to those 2G boards that we used to get using a SIMCOM module, but it will be for 4G LTE using a newer SIMCOM module. So we'll give you all the info next month once we've got all the boards back from the manufacturer and we're ready to start distributing them.
But Jim,
Okay, thank you.
Jim, I think to your initial point of like why yours didn't fail and why others failed, I think it was a pretty situational thing. And I don't know, Shannon, was it ever really figured out as to why certain ones were failing? But it seemed like on certain stations they just failed more consistently.
Well, part of it was the software that was the firmware that was on the modules. They've also gone through multiple revisions of the hardware over the last couple of years. So things are probably a little bit better with them now, but the bigger issue right now is because of the ongoing electronics worldwide shortage that's happening. The procurement of anything using a lot of these circuit components are very hard to find right now, and those cell boards, the Digi 4G LTE cell boards, look to be on back order until about this time next year. So anybody who's looking to buy a newer one is going to have to wait until at least sometime next year to be able to get those from the manufacturer. So there's a giant shortage of cellular boards right now, and it was easier for us to just make our own so we could be in charge of that supply chain and not be kind of captive to one particular board that we didn't have control over the production of. So everything should be a lot smoother and easier to work with starting next month.
Excellent. Thank you, Shannon. Great information. All right. Any other questions before we move on?
Hello, this is Francis here. And
Hey,
I'd like to ask a question. Hi, David. Hi, Shannon. Hi, everybody else. And that is in the acquiring sensors page that you just showed us. Is there one that has the acquiring? I think we're going to probably need to test and swap out our depth gauge. And the conductivity is working perfectly. It's calibrated. It's been run, but our depth is still kind of squirrelish. So is there a purchase connection for that?
Yes. So we have, as we know, and as Shannon alluded to with supply issues, we've had a pretty long stretch of not being able to do troubleshooting as we would prefer and sensor replacements as we would prefer.
Right.
We're kind of making the decision over the last couple weeks to go with the Generation 1 CTD sensors
Right.
for a little while longer, because they've been kind of putting off the Generation 2 for a while now. We just need to go ahead with the Generation 1. So yeah, so we will be in touch, Francis, over the next several weeks. I think, and Rachel, maybe we should talk with Francis after the call or tomorrow or something, just to make sure that we're on the same page with how we're approaching his two stations. I think we've got it situated, Francis.
Yeah.
But we'll just make sure we've got our specifics down on what needs to happen at those. You're talking about the Phillips Mill station.
Yes, Phillips Mill, the Solbury station is running perfectly.
Okay.
Seems to be fine. Okay.
All right.
Thank you. Thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks, Francis.
If I could just follow up on that, I just would like to congratulate Francis Collins, who was made president of Primrose Creek Watershed Association.
Oh, wow.
Now, there you go. Throw campaign money our way and we'll put it in the sensors. How's that? Thank you, Kevin. Appreciate it.
Anyway, I just want to thank him. I'm in the same watershed as he is.
That's right. I'm running the show now. Salaries
I just want to thank him for his dedication.
Oh, thank you. Thank you, Kevin.
That's wonderful to hear. Francis really connects the dots and really makes things clear for people. So he's really doing some neat stuff there. And I think he's really making a difference. So great job, Francis, and congrats.
Well, I got great support from all you, and we'll continue to.
Cool. Good.
Hitch our wagon to the Stroud, Stroud intelligentsia. Thank you.
All right. Any other questions before we move on to Mike's presentation? Okay, I will stop share. Oh no, actually I'll go here. So Mike Burns, there's Mike in his official Villanova gear. He's going to be talking about Jenkintown Creek and Naylor's Run in the Philly area. He's got some pretty nice topics to discuss, and I will pass it on to Mike, stop share, and let Mike take over share screen and proceed. So Mike, it's all yours.
All right, thank you. So hello, everyone. My name is Mike Burns, and today I'm going to take the opportunity to touch on a lot of my master's work at Villanova University as part of the Delaware River Watershed Initiative. My research centered around evapotranspiration processes in a rain garden, providing me some insight on what to look for in other systems as I begin a PhD program at Villanova. Before I dive in, I would just like to mention that in the hydrologic cycle, evapotranspiration is a term that combines evaporation and transpiration processes together in a singular, convenient water removal mechanic for such studies. So for today's talk, I want to focus on the following areas. I will spend some time describing the site in some minor detail, looking at the data sources and how I processed a lot of the inputs from my methods. I will then describe the accepted models that have been used to predict potential evapotranspiration and how I use those approaches in my study. Then I will highlight a mass balance approach to quantifying or measuring evapotranspiration and how using changes in soil moisture was the main calculation mechanic for that. And then I'll present some of my general results for the period of study. I will then touch on how these results can be used to inform some research plans for a new stormwater control measure at Naylor's Run, emphasizing some lessons learned in maintenance and monitoring of these types of controls. Finally, I will briefly discuss what I aim to study at Villanova over the next couple of years. So for the site description and data collection, I'll keep it brief for the sake of time, but if you're interested in some of the finer details, please contact me after the presentation. I'll be happy to provide them for you. The core of the research focused on how a rain garden can store water for use in evapotranspiration. As part of the DRWI, I've been afforded the opportunity to monitor and maintain a fully designed rain garden at Abington Friends School located in Jenkintown, Pennsylvania. The image shown here is a nice snapshot of the rain garden where vegetation is at its mature crop heights, taken during Tropical Storm Isaias of last year. From a design standpoint, it is a typical bowl-shaped basin that manages a 1-inch storm event with runoff coming from the connected parking lot, which equates to about 17,000 square feet shown on the right of the slide here. When it comes to evapotranspiration, the storage of the media layer is rather important. For the rain garden, the media layer is 6 inches thick and it conforms to the USDA designation for loamy sand, with the soil type, grain size, and percent distribution adhering to the presented table on this slide. By design, there is a 9-inch ponding depth for the incoming runoff or rain that falls on the rain garden surface. Over time, infiltration to the media layer is observed, contributing to internal water storage and percolation processes. Recommended plantings were installed throughout the rain garden by NAM Planning and Design. For evapotranspiration, an average crop height of 2 feet was used as evidenced by multiple measurements taken throughout the rain garden. Some crop heights fell below 2 feet, while others pictured here were above 3 feet. So for the calculations that I described later, the crop height measurements were used as a verification for a tall crop type designation. The core of the study was to quantify the different elements of the water budget at Abington Friends School and isolate evapotranspiration's role in water removal for stormwater management. So because of that, the parameters of focus are broken into inputs and outputs. For this study, the inputs are inflow from the contributing drainage area and precipitation on the rain garden surface. The outputs then are defined as water leaving the rain garden through outflow and water removed via evapotranspiration, which again is a term that combines water returned to the atmosphere via evaporation and water that leaves plant life through transpiration also back to the atmosphere together. Percolation is considered in the study, but with some assumptions later on that I'll describe. So to collect the data, various instruments have been deployed on site. The table presented here details the instruments, locations, sensors, and variables that each one measures. All data are collected on a continuous scale, averaged and reported on 5-minute intervals. The 5-minute data is then converted to daily averages for the period of record, which is 2017 to 2018. And that makes sense for evapotranspiration. I want to emphasize the point that evapotranspiration might be better looked at a daily scale rather than a continuous scale like the 5-minute interval data. The data set is then further restricted from March to September in the respective years, since evapotranspiration is primarily in operation during these months due to the vegetation growth patterns and the temperate climate we experience in this area. Any days where precipitation is observed are removed from the analysis, and that is because the assumption is made that evapotranspiration is not occurring when rain is introduced to the system. The first picture presented here on the slide is the weather station that captures data relevant for the predictive evapotranspiration equations as well as rainfall. The second picture highlights the relative locations in the rain garden for the soil moisture sensors and the bubbler chamber, which is measuring water level within the basin. Finally, the third picture shows the orifice outflow configuration and the pressure transducer alignment so that discharge from the rain garden to the headwaters of Jenkintown Creek can be quantified. So all of these things considered, you might be wondering why the study is focusing on evapotranspiration. Traditionally speaking, rain gardens are investigated based on the infiltration that is occurring within the system. All policies, manuals, and best management practices for designs give most credit to infiltration performance with little consideration for evapotranspiration. But in reality, evapotranspiration accounts for a large portion of water quantity management for stormwater, and rain gardens have been designed to promote evapotranspiration performance. So it stands to reason that ET be looked at with more detail and maybe in a simpler way so that future resilient designs can be optimized for a balance of evapotranspiration and infiltration performance, not just infiltration alone. So now that you have orientation to the site and understand my motivation and where the data is coming from, we can turn our attention to the first goal of the study, which was looking at potential evapotranspiration using accepted predictive models. The two equations of focus for potential evapotranspiration are the ASCE Penman-Monteith equation and the Hargreaves model. As you can see, there is a suite of inputs here that are required for both, with a certain level of complexity that is difficult to navigate and can introduce room for error, especially when you look at something like the radiation budget, which has 7 terms on its own. Both approaches are reliable for determining what ET value is possible given the status of the climate for a given day. And they produce a reference value, which is further corrected by a soil moisture extraction function that I used standard values for field capacity and wilting point for a rain garden of this design for. It's the adjusted values that are calculated using the soil moisture extraction function and a crop coefficient that are used for the analysis that will follow. So the first potential ET that we look at will focus on values obtained using the Hargreaves approach. Presented here is a time series from March to September in 2017. The most striking aspect of the potential ET is the seasonality that is displayed in green there. Peak values align with meteorological summer and minimum values are observed in late spring. For 2018, that seasonality exists, but not as prominently. Again, peak values align with the summer and smaller values are found in the early spring. The seasonality evidenced through these ET values do make sense as the climate is temperate and such variability is expected. So for both years, I compared them in a box plot here. The median values are pretty comparable to each other with little variation to the quartile ranges. The caveat with that is that the Hargreaves approach relies on temperature for its calculation. So any trends in temperature will match trends observed for evapotranspiration. The plot on the right reinforces this, showing how the Hargreaves potential evapotranspiration has a temperature dependence, as seen by the strong agreement between the two parameters. Next, we will look at the Penman-Monteith calculated potential evapotranspiration. While more complicated in terms of the amount of terms involved in the calculation, it's clear that the output also produced a seasonality trend. Unexpectedly, the peak values for potential evapotranspiration in 2017 occurred in the late spring to summer months. The smaller values, again, were found to occur in the early spring. The same trend holds true for 2018. It's important to note that in both years, the values for Penman-Monteith tend to be on average about 2 millimeters a day higher in the peak season than the Hargreaves output. This result is likely due to Penman-Monteith's consideration to the radiation budget, which Hargreaves does not give as much weight to in its calculation. So in comparing Penman-Monteith 2017 and 2018 distributions, there's little variation with the median values. An expansion for the quartile range is observed from 2017 to 2018, but this is likely due to some larger values present in the distribution in 2018 that might be unrealistic for the system, such as 10 millimeters a day. That is a little high for a rain garden of this design. In looking at each approach by year, the clear result is that the Hargreaves distributions produce values that are less than the Penman-Monteith distributions, no matter what year you're looking at. The wide ranges present in the Penman-Monteith distributions highlight some fluctuations in evapotranspiration, indicating a high amount of variability for the metric, which again is an expectation of ET behavior. Hargreaves shows this, but to a lesser degree, especially in 2018. So to put some numbers to it, we look at the 95% confidence intervals for the measures of central tendency. And there's a bit of a stronger agreement observed with about a 1 millimeter a day difference between the Hargreaves and Penman-Monteith approaches. It is worth noting that both Hargreaves and Penman-Monteith operate on a theoretical continuous scale, which could open the door for some overprediction of evapotranspiration in some instances. The data obtained from this portion of the analysis supports this conclusion, with large ET values associated with time periods where water was known to not be in the rain garden system at all. The next phase of the study was to look at a simpler approach to measuring evapotranspiration, which was using changes in soil moisture as a mass balance calculation technique. So for calculation of ET in this way, the first thing to do was to look at the systems as inputs being equal to outputs in a hydrologic balance. For this study, the inputs are precipitation on the rain garden surface and inflow calculated using a modified curve number approach from the connected parking lot. The outputs from the system are the outflow measured at the orifice and a change in storage term that looks at the storage capacity of the media layer. The change in storage term is defined as water loss to evapotranspiration and water loss to percolation to the groundwater table. In this study, percolation is assumed to no longer occur 24 hours after ponding is observed. And I want to emphasize that this is not to say that percolation is not occurring after 24 hours. It's more to account for the range of values observed. So some systems experience percolation days after a storm event, while others may only have a few hours of percolation performance. So to accommodate this range, the 24-hour assumption is adopted, with some evidence corresponding to the specific rain garden at Abington provided by previous studies by Dr. Wesson Muhammad. The modified change in storage term is then further defined as change in soil moisture at each sensor depth, which is the basis for the ET definition used in this study. So using those changes in soil moisture to measure ET, the output from the analysis produced a trend that did not rely on temperature or radiation spikes. Instead, peaks for ET are observed to occur days after a significant rainfall event is recorded. Intuitively, this makes sense, as ET would not be able to occur if water was not in the system. Some seasonality does exist in 2017, but this is explained by the intensity and frequency of spring and summer rainfall events as opposed to a normal distribution of temperature or radiation throughout the year. In 2018, there is no significant seasonality observed using this approach. ET does occur following rain events, especially in July and August, but in May and June, there is a rather glaring trend of frequent rain events and minimum evapotranspiration performance. While more investigation is required, a reasonable explanation might be that the sensors are indicating high saturation due to frequent back-to-back events. ET could be occurring, but the soil moisture sensors might not be able to track the water removal through ET accurately. Still, the fluctuation observed through this approach in both years adds some confidence that ET depends on water availability and vegetation health as opposed to the climate patterns observed. And for completeness, I just wanted to highlight the distributions of the measured ET calculated using changes in soil moisture for each year. In 2017, a wide range is observed, which aligns with the expected performance of ET. The distribution in 2018 is a bit tighter, but there are presence of some elevated values that align with independent storm events that produce an ET value that makes sense for the system. The confidence intervals for the measurement's essential tendency also adhere to what is expected of a rain garden in a temperate climate, which, if you recall, are less than those produced by the predictive models. Quantiles for each approach were calculated for the sake of comparison of the predictive equations to the measured ET. In performing this analysis, the goal is to look at how the distributions match with each other. For both years, an exponential relationship between potential evapotranspiration and measured evapotranspiration exists, regardless of method. So from this analysis, it can be concluded that physical parameters heavily influence evapotranspiration performance. For the predictive models, elevated values correspond to peaks in climate parameters. For the measured evapotranspiration, an elevated value may correspond to a particular storm event. This emphasizes the fact that in evapotranspiration study, it's important to understand the nuance of each method and any potential bias associated with the calculation. That being said, the correlation between the large values for evapotranspiration across all methods indicates that the soil moisture approach is viable for a rain garden, especially when water is known to be in the system. For a more numerical look, I've presented the results of the different distributions here by year. As you can see, there is some disagreement between measured evapotranspiration and the potential evapotranspiration, especially in 2018. In both years, potential evapotranspiration is shown to be over-predicting what is considered measured evapotranspiration for the rain garden. Granted, some measurements of central tendencies seem to align, but the quartile ranges tell a different story. There is, however, some agreement between the rainfall and the measured ET distributions, adding some more confidence to the fact that ET depends on water availability instead of the meteorological conditions. So to statistically describe the behavior of the distribution, some goodness of fit tests were performed in Minitab software. In doing so, the Hargreaves approach and the soil moisture approach for ET rejected the null hypothesis, checking for a normal distribution, whereas the Penman-Monteith model accepted that hypothesis of a normal distribution. Since we're focusing on measured ET with the soil moisture sensors, there was some interest in determining what the appropriate fit was. I looked at a lot of different models and approaches, and the best fit was the theoretical Weibull distribution. In short, this distribution can be used to describe data that has some natural variability to it, which is expected for evapotranspiration behavior. As you can see, the predictive equations in red and green in the plot do not follow what the theoretical 45-degree line is for a Weibull fit, which would be from the bottom left to the top right. A different numerical indicator for the fit is the beta value presented at the bottom here, where a value above 1 aligns with data that surround a certain range. So it could be between 1 and 3, and most of the distribution is between 1 and 3 millimeters a day. In other words, the predictive models do not account for ET when it's unseasonably high or unseasonably low. It is possible to have a day with 0 evapotranspiration, so you would expect the distribution to account for that. A beta value around 1 adheres to data with a natural variability expected, which is what is seen with the measured evapotranspiration approach. In 2018, the soil moisture ET also follows the Weibull distribution rather nicely. In both years, Hargreaves and Penman-Monteith have beta values much higher than 1, which is why the prediction for potential ET from one day to the next might not vary as much. The consequence of this approach is the possibility of over-predicting or under-predicting ET for the system. Since water availability is not considered in those models, it's likely that it's over-prediction that's occurring. So as you may have noticed, I spent a lot of time over the last 2 years monitoring and maintaining a physical research site, as well as the data sets associated with evaluating the rain garden performance. During that time, I've learned plenty of lessons with such a system, and it's my hope to share that some of my experiences can assist this group with their endeavors. So when it comes to fieldwork, the best advice I can give is prepare ahead of time before setting out for your task. Make sure that you understand your task fully so that you can identify which tools, devices, batteries, communication cables, and whatever software programs you need for any instrumentation are. When I say expect the unexpected, I have found that in my experience, certain things can occur that you may not plan for. So for example, at the Jenkintown Creek site, we discovered that a storm rolled through the system and destroyed some of our equipment. Fortunately, we had the hardware required to stabilize the structures for the next storm that was going to come through that week. We didn't anticipate destruction, but we had the tools required to fix it then and there. And to that point, I advocate for documenting everything and anything. I always take pictures at the research sites, trying to capture the situation before, during, and after any fieldwork occurs. I also take good field notes, as it's important to have a record of what occurs and when changes happen to a system. From a physical safety standpoint, long pants, durable shoes, layers in the winter, sunscreen in the summer are kind of the main things that I always try to keep track of. It's also important to have water and some form of like a communication protocol should anything occur out in the field. When maintaining a stormwater control measure that's vegetated like this and capturing runoff from an impervious surface, there are two perspectives worth considering: the instrumentation health, if you're collecting data, or just the general performance of the stormwater control measure. In my experience, the most frequent issues I've encountered were wire replacements, battery changes, issues with the programming of an instrument, and some inexplicable sensor interruptions. Manufacturer manuals are the best resource for troubleshooting out in the field, but if the problem does persist, most companies have a tech support that are easy to communicate with. When looking at a SCM from a visual inspection standpoint, I always check for debris at the inflow and outflow points of the system. Since these are environmental systems, debris can accumulate over time, and cleaning out these parts is essential to maintain the performance of the SCM. It's also a good idea to look at vegetation health and maybe identify any invasives that are there. For a rain garden, it's a good idea to do a site visit after a storm event to see if ponding is occurring shortly after. Give it some time and then head back to the site and see if the ponded water has infiltrated, since that's the design of the system. Finally, identify any problems with the engineered structure. Are the inflow and outflow locations connected hydrologically or hydraulically? Are there any openings that water can exit through? And those are like the things to look for to make sure that it's performing correctly. For the research that we do, data collection and management is certainly a daunting task. For all sensors, data that I've dealt with, the data is collected on a continuous scale. And this, in my opinion, is of great benefit for monitoring environmental systems that are focused on stormwater management. So when researching on a timescale like this, it's possible to identify the conditions of a system before, during, and after an event moves through. Peaks in water quality or water quantity parameters can be easily identified for these events, helping establish the benefits of the SCM performance. Of course, outliers exist in such rich data sets, and it's important to account for those. For these, I recommend to look at the context of the data. If the rainflow is low, but the flow is high, then that's an indication that one of the devices is not operating correctly. Data from neighboring sites or other devices might help fill in those gaps. Another option might be to look at the manufacturer's detection limits of a sensor. If a value is produced that's beyond these limits, then confidence is increased that it might not be right. Once the data is collected and processed, then we can turn to visualization. Spatial and temporal scales are important, and you may want to ask yourself what you would value as an audience member. For example, like I was mentioning before, evapotranspiration is not really a useful metric on a continuous scale with 5-minute intervals. There would be little to no fluctuation from one timestamp to the next. So instead, I elected to look at it on a daily scale, and that was a more appropriate choice for this data type. Flow rate, on the other hand, might be better on a small time scale, as the peak in the storm flow can easily be identified. In either case, an attractive plot that is clear and attention grabbing is the way to go in order to reach a wider audience and complete the story that you're trying to tell. So in short, those were the results of what my master's work at Villanova was, as well as some lessons that I learned in order to be an effective researcher. Now I'll spend some time to discuss what I hope to research as part of the PhD program here. As part of the project I work on, there is a new system that has been constructed with the goal of improving the water quality and water quantity of Naylor's Run, which is a tributary of the Cobbs Creek watershed. The system is comprised of different SCM types functioning as what we term as a treatment train. The first part of the system operates as a rain garden optimized for evapotranspiration and infiltration performance, where the second part functions as a bioswale for the conveyance of the water to the creek, providing some water quantity benefits in slowing down the flow. The team at Villanova has begun instrumenting the system with auto-samplers, water level sensors, and soil moisture sensors to track the water quality and water quantity trends of the system. Within the system, there is a within the stream, I'm sorry, there is a flow meter deployed measuring flow, as well as a conductivity sensor to look at that aspect of water quality. Even further downstream, there is an EnviroDIY logger system that measures turbidity and temperature of the water after the storm flow has been treated by the train I described. With the data sets provided by the system, we can look at how the combined SCMs operate to improve the water quality of the stream, looking at how suspended solids can be reduced at several points within the freshwater system. Thermal pollution is also a concern, which, thanks to the devices throughout the stream, can be tracked and discussed after more data is collected. As we move forward with instrumentation and monitoring, all the data collection from the different sensors will help inform about the water quality and water quantity of Naylor's Run. The goal is to provide sufficient numerical results to highlight how a treatment train approach to stormwater control can improve the waterways of urban systems. From a water quality standpoint, we will measure constituents inside the SCM as well as inside the stream at various points. We will have the ability to perform some comparisons between the two, as well as differences between the rain garden portion and the bioswale portion. Based on how we collect data, we can also perform some evaluations of water quality for storm events, as well as base flow or low flow conditions. In terms of water quantity, the data collected will help inform about evapotranspiration performance of the rain garden, as well as the overall hydrologic budget of the system. The changes between inflow, outflow, and stream flow can be monitored with comparisons made pre and post SCM installation. As with water quality, the flow comparisons can be made between storm and base flow events. And fortunately, we have an experienced team with some wonderful partners like Stroud and their EnviroDIY programming that can help address these questions as we design for resilient stormwater control measures. As always, I must take the time to acknowledge the team at Villanova who assisted with the research over the last 2 years. Specifically, I'd like to give my appreciation to Dr. Andrea Welker, Dr. Amanda Hess, and Dr. John Kamlos for their insight, guidance, and feedback. I'm also very thankful to the rest of the V-Crews department, especially the names you see listed here associated with our program and the project. And finally, this research would not be possible without the central focus of the Delaware River Watershed Initiative and the funding provided by the William Penn Foundation. And with that, I will open it up to some questions, recommendations, and general feedback.
Wonderful.
I have a question.
Go for it, Jim.
Yeah, wait a minute. I gotta get my picture. I gotta change cameras here. There we go. Yeah, the ET, you mentioned temperature, but wouldn't humidity and solar radiation have a big influence on evapro? In other words, if it's 100% humidity, it wouldn't matter what the temperature is. You would have no evapro transmission.
Right. And that's right here in the calculations, and I kind of glossed over it a little bit. But when we look at the predictive models, we see which parameters influence the final output the most. And temperature and radiation were determined to have the strongest influence on the predictive output.
I would have thought the humidity would be a factor.
Yeah, I imagine, I didn't look at it specifically, but I imagine the same kind of dependency is also evident. I mean, I did do calculations with relative humidity, some saturation pressures, and all the other meteorological parameters collected at the weather station required for these equations. And I didn't look at like that influence specifically. I just saw radiation and temperature and the magnitude of those parameters.
Right. One more question. SCM, what's that stand for?
Yeah, so it's on the first slide, and I kind of glossed over it.
Stormwater control. Okay, thank
Yeah,
you.
vegetated stormwater control measure.
Got it.
Thanks, Jim. Dave Yake has a question. Yake?
Yeah, Mike, thanks very much for the presentation. I appreciated it. One of the things, the work that I have looked at over the last few years is in regard to hydrologic modeling of watersheds.
Yeah.
And a lot of work done by the USGS talks about potential ET in a watershed when you're looking at a water budget in these models. And in an important part of it during the summertime, when there's a lack of rain, is how far down do the root systems go? And at some point, ET begins to drop off.
Right.
And I guess my question then for you is, how does that affect, how did you account for that in your rain garden experiment? Did you have an absolute depth that you knew in your rain garden because the water flowed out at, let's say, an interval of 18 inches below the top of the ground? I wonder if you could expand on that.
Yeah, so the way that we deploy the soil moisture sensors are different depths within the rain garden like media layer. And we know the species of plants that was planted in the system. And we know what the typical root length of that vegetation is at its maturity. So that kind of root zone aligns with where the sensors are deployed, and we can isolate which sensor is tracking infiltration or which sensor is looking at the transpiration process, so that we can kind of investigate what the plant performance is. As part of the PhD work, I want to look a little bit more in detail about it and model it using Hydra software, where it's really a more geotechnical approach to looking at evapotranspiration.
Okay, thanks.
Okay, any other questions for Mike at this point? I think this.
Yeah, I have one, Dave. Mike, nice presentation. Question. You're looking at percolation, and I know you mentioned at the beginning, and perk is really important, of course, to recharge water table, which then leads to recharge stream flow. Right. Majority of perk, I've always assumed, occurs late fall, winter, early spring, just because of temperature and relation, and also photosynthesis. Is that true? And how much perk, if any, does really occur in the summertime? And I don't even know if you have, when you got ET being dominant.
Right. Yeah, that's a really good question. And again, something that I hope to have some more details and some more results to properly address it. For this study, I looked at percolation as part of the water budget, but the assumption was made that it was negligible after a 24-hour time period based on what other studies have shown and kind of the range of percolation that has been observed, whether it's a few hours of percolation performance or days of percolation performance. We have some model results from different studies that look at percolation independently. And while I didn't present those there, I hope to use those to help inform my Hydrus models that I spoke about to really isolate percolation from the budget and isolate evapotranspiration from the budget, and maybe have a more number-oriented answer for you.
Thank you.
Mike, just a quick question. On your PhD work, do you plan to develop hydrologic models for Naylor Run to predict the base flow, separate base flow from runoff, and so on?
We have in our team for this project, we have a postdoctoral researcher that is really focusing on modeling Naylor's Run from that perspective. I'm more interested in like the vegetated stormwater control performance and how that can help with water quality and water quantity. Hopefully all the pieces come together to tell a really nice narrative of what's happening within Naylor's Run.
Okay, thanks.
Great. All right, we are at 3:21 here. Mike, thank you for that presentation. It really provided a lot of.
Control.
Does someone have a question there?
Did your quality control match up with your sensor readings? And we ask you if your SIM card is active and funded. Literally everything we just talked about. It's kind of cool as a final review.
I think Francis was watching my presentation. I'm like, that's my voice, but I'm not speaking.
Good sleuthing on that, Rachel. I had no clue what was happening.
Do we still want to be recording this part?
Oh yeah,
Everyone?
let's stop recording now.